The United States and Russia spent 12 long hours in discussions yesterday at the technical level in Saudi Arabia. And today, the United States is meeting again with their Ukrainian counterparts, trying to find out if there's any path to ending the war. As it turns out, the Russian side is being kind of slow about all this. And in response, the Ukraine side is actually getting complaints both about the United States and about Russia. We'll see, do they have the standing to make such complaints? And to try to unpack a lot of what's going on and take a look at further, we have the ever-popular Colonel Doug McGregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat vet and expert on these kinds of war and peace issues. Doug, as always, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan.
Listen, we'll just jump right into it because one of the first things that I want to show is a clip from Zelensky. And you would think that being the junior partner on the Western side and not even being a partner on the Russian side, that he might want to, especially in light of what happened in the Oval Office a few weeks back, might want to be a little bit more reserved. But instead, he just can't seem to help himself. And he says stuff like this.
Єдиним суб'єктом, який затягує цю війну і знущається з наших людей і з усього світу. І щоб дотиснути Росію до миру, потрібні сильні речі, сильні кроки. Ми готові підтримувати кожну сильну ініціативу, яка зробить дипломатію більш результативною. А це означає, треба тиском змушувати Росію до бажання закінчити війну. І це санкції, це підтримка України, це міжнародна координація.
So, I mean, Doug, what do you make of that? Because, I mean, he said that, he's mad because Russia's dragging out these negotiations and we have to force them to want to make peace. Is that even possible?
Of course not. And I would go one step further and I would say that to this point in time, our friend Zelensky has been spitting in Donald Trump's face. President Trump, tried very hard, bent over backwards to try and accommodate him and tried to fashion a ceasefire with President Putin, as you know. And the Ukrainians almost immediately broke the ceasefire, violated it. And all the statements they've made, everything coming out of Ukraine has been vitriol directed at us. And it's impossible to develop or formulate any sort of peace agreement with this man in power. I think he should be removed. And if we're not going to do that, then I think we have to get out. We have to simply leave Ukraine because this man is a danger at this point to everyone. Because you have President Putin who said, yes, we want to end this war. And we want to end the war. And you have these irresponsible actors in London and Paris who think that somehow or another, by threatening to go it alone, that we can be goaded into supporting them. That's absurd. Any European that tries to move European forces into Western Ukraine is going to fail because they can't do anything without us. So the whole idea is appalling. Zelensky is appalling. President Trump needs to pull the plug on this man.
You mentioned that he has been spitting in Trump's face for a while. You may recall it was some number of months back. It may have been just after Trump had assumed power, and Zelensky is complaining that Trump is being manipulated by Putin, which of course harkened back to the whole issue of the Russiagate and all the charges that went with that. So it didn't sit well with the president. Well, turns out he's done it again. And this is from the Ukraine media from today. He's actually complaining that Russia has managed to influence some in the White House. Zelensky tells Time magazine, and they had that big spread on him. I think the third one they've had during the war, which is not a very attractive portrait of him, I would say. But it stuns me that you're going to tell Time magazine again, especially in light of what's already happened twice. And he's going to make these kinds of condescending comments. What does that tell you about where the mind of Zelensky is?
Zelensky is behaving the way he is because he has support from people inside the Beltway, not just in Paris and London, but also inside the Beltway. And sadly, increasingly from Berlin. Look, President Trump needs to make it very clear that he will not support this conflict any longer. As soon as he does that and terminates any and all military aid to Ukraine, I think Zelensky and his friends will begin filling up their duffel bags with cash and looking for planes, trains, and automobiles out of Ukraine. These people are corrupt. The people in Washington that are taking his side are the same people that helped to start this war in Ukraine. They don't deserve any attention whatsoever. President Trump was elected because he is viewed as someone who actually cares about the individual American citizen, as someone who shares the views, the attitudes, the interests of the average American. He knows Americans are completely disinterested in going to war for any reason with anybody over Ukraine. He knows that. So he needs to brush off Zelensky like the sort of annoying gnat that he is, and he needs to effectively ignore these voices inside the Beltway who have been lining their pockets with cash as a result of this horrific war and the deaths of 1.2 million Ukrainian soldiers and 100,000 dead Russians. This has got to stop. The only way to stop that is to end the aid and to pull all of the Americans in and out of uniform that are in Ukraine right now out of Ukraine. That's what needs to happen. There's no other solution. And the sooner he does it, the better for Europe, the better for everyone.
So now, obviously, they're in the process right now of having negotiations. Yeah, that's what one of our viewers mentioned a minute ago. That's Moscow Burning in part of that Time magazine there, where Zelensky's attempting to send a signal, but I don't think it's working quite the way he'd hoped that it would. But I think, again, that just shows you where he's at in this. While we're trying to negotiate peace, he's intentionally sending something that's a very provocative signal to Moscow, which is obviously also what he has been doing. You mentioned one a minute ago where he fired a bunch of drones at some energy infrastructure within hours of the last negotiations after he had agreed to try to seek a negotiated settlement, et cetera. But then what about the United States? Because Trump is putting a whole bunch of energy into this right now. For example, yesterday there was reportedly a 12-hour session at the technical level with the Russians. And so the question is, should Trump just say, all right, you know what, just forget about all that. We're going to do what Doug McGregor just said. How does he uncouple from what he's been doing?
Well, first and foremost, President Trump's strategic objective is to normalize relations with Russia. That's very important. You know, that's something that he wanted to do during his first term, was unable to do it. Now is his opportunity. There is no reason for conflict between us and Moscow. None. No reason whatsoever. This conflict in Ukraine was cultivated and artificially developed by a small number of people from Washington inside the intelligence services, the CIA, MI6, and so forth, who had an agenda. And this agenda goes back to the end of the Cold War, which is how do we destabilize, undermine, and destroy Russia? That was never President Trump's goal. He wants nothing to do with that. That has to be kept in mind. And his number one goal, which is normalization of relations with Russia, should be the all-overarching, all-encompassing objective. Whatever else happens shrinks to insignificance next to that. Secondly, I'm sure the Russians have sorted through in great detail what they want to keep, what they're willing to give up, and what they want Ukraine to look like after the war is over. We've never really made that clear. The people that started the war, they wanted to destroy Russia and at the same time reconquer the Crimea and make Ukraine this allegedly liberal democratic utopia that would operate as an armed force in perpetuity against Russia. It's all nonsense. That's all failed. So we have to look at what the Russians say they need and say they want, because the Russians live there. They live next to Ukraine. We do not. Our interest ought to be in a neutral Ukraine. The most important thing for us from the very beginning was that this Ukrainian neutrality operate as a bridge between us and Russia, between Europe and Russia. It becomes a neutral ground where there will be no fighting, no military forces, no military competition. And that's something that's very desirable because we want to end any future possibility of war in the region. That's the Russian goal. Now, I haven't seen the details that you spoke of, but I'm sure the Russians are very, very detailed in what they would like to see happen. And without seeing that, I can't evaluate where we should say yes or no. But I think we have to understand the Russians have won this war. And if you're going to tell the Russians no, you have to go back to square one. We're not going to do business with you. The Russians will cross the river and move west. I suspect they'll move to Odessa and they'll move into Kiev. And now at that point, they'll probably stop and there'll be a resumption of movement further west until, if necessary, they've gone all that distance in order to guarantee there is no threat to them inside Ukraine. That's not what they want to do. That's what they will do. We need to understand that. And saying that they can't do that or they're not strong enough, that's a lot of nonsense. Hopefully, we've learned by now, Dan, Russia is quite capable of doing what it says.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see if they demonstrate that on the ground. We see the potential out there, but I honestly thought they would have done it many months ago because the weakened side of the Ukraine. But it appears that, and I've seen a lot of this on some Russian media and Telegram channels, that there's a lot of frustration on the Russian military side. Is the same thing as you and I've thought. They also think, and of course, according to these guys, they see that they have the capacity and they wonder why it's not being employed, while they're still saying after this basically platoon and squad size nibbling on the edges to continue to moving forward, as opposed to, big arrow kind of movements, which they haven't even attempted.
Well, Dan, what we need to keep in mind is that without us, the Europeans can do nothing. They don't have the command and control structure. They don't have the space-based intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets. They cannot move their forces into Western Ukraine and present any formidable obstacle to Russian military power without us.
I don't think they could do it with us either, though, on the ground.
Well, that may be true, but from our standpoint, that's an easy solution.
Yeah.
You tell London and Paris, if you're that stupid and this is what you want to do, bear in mind, we're not going. And you get us out of Ukraine. And at the end of the day, the Russians who live there, the Russians who own the terrain, the Russians who have historically dominated that part of the world for hundreds of years, are going to do so in the future. We need to come to terms with that. That's not a bad thing necessarily for us by any means. And it doesn't have to be a bad thing for Europeans if what remains of Ukraine when the war is over is neutral. And
right.
that has to be driven across again and again and again.
Absolutely. That's without question, taking the emotions out of it. That is the best thing at this stage for everybody. The best thing would have been just to apply the Minsk agreements before, and Ukraine would still exist minus Crimea to this day, but we won't relitigate all that. This is where we are now, and we have to deal with what it is. Conversely, after this 12-hour session, and remember, this whole negotiating period started when President Trump got on the phone with Putin. Trump tried to get Putin to have a 30-day full ceasefire. He said, well, I'll do an energy and a Black Sea limited ceasefire for 30 days, and then we'll see what happens from there. So coming out of this 12 hours from yesterday, Lavrov said this as an update of kind of where the Russians are on those 2 points.
We are ready to consider agreeing not to harm the energy infrastructure. We are in favor of resuming in a more acceptable form of the Black Sea Initiative. The Black Sea Initiative as a priority was discussed in Riyadh, and our position is simple. We're not going to take anyone's word. We're not going to take that man's word.
And so he didn't just go into any more detail of what he meant by that, other than saying categorically what President Putin said he wanted and agreed to with Trump. He said they're still willing to do that, but we're not going to just take anyone's word for it. What do you think that's going to translate to on those two topics of the energy infrastructure and the Black Sea deal?
I think President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov will continue to be polite and do what they can to accommodate President Trump, because I think they know that he's sincere and wants to end this conflict. But I also think they are not convinced that he can do that because of all the other actors on the stage right now in the West, here in Washington, as well as in Western Europe. And so I think the Russians will press forward and secure their objectives in this war: the denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine, and the neutralization of the future state. They will do whatever is necessary to achieve those outcomes. If that means crossing the Dnieper and going down to Odessa, they'll do that. Keep in mind that their concern about the Black Sea is very obvious. The Ukrainians were told that they could export grain, and that was fine. But then they tried to use the ships that exported grain when they came back to carry weapons, and that was unacceptable. So the Russians have been down this road before. And again, I think they want to accommodate President Trump because they, under no circumstances, want to go to war with us at all. No one does. There's no reason for any war in that region of the world at all. And they know that. We know that, I think. I think President Trump certainly does. But they're going to be skeptical. And so while they will listen and they will be polite and they will try to accommodate us, they will still press ahead and do what they think is necessary on the ground to secure their interests.
And to exactly that end, one of the other things in a separate interview that Lavrov said, where he was looking beyond just the temporary ceasefire, but towards what is going to be required for an end of war negotiation in terms, he again hit on this denazification topic.
We will not leave unattended the task of denazification of the state that remains under the control of the Kyiv regime, which legislatively and physically exterminates the all-Russian language, culture, media, and canonical orthodoxy in direct and gross violation of Article 1 of the UN Charter and Ukraine's international obligations, with complete negligence and complicity from others. European states, which loudly proclaim their commitment to human rights and minority rights everywhere except in Ukraine, as I have already mentioned. But Ukraine is different. These are nurtured Nazis for yet another attempt to rally all of Europe under Russian Nazi banners for a war against the Russian Federation.
Now, the way that was presented from the Russian side was that this is giving some kind of indication that maybe there's not even going to be a ceasefire. And I think that you can read that because the limited ceasefire, the no energy infrastructure, and the Black Sea stuff, that is like almost on a separate track, because the objective from the U.S. and the Ukraine side was a full 30-day ceasefire leading to the negotiations to end the war. But if they're saying, the Russians are, that part of our terms are going to be the denazification, that's obviously a pretty tough pill for the Ukraine side to swallow, which would imply there's no point in going to a full ceasefire if that's not even going to be on the table, because then what are you going to have a discussion about?
Well, I suppose so. But again, this is really up to us. This war would never have happened if it were not for us. Without our aid, our support, our instigation, our encouragement, there would have been no war against Russia in Ukraine. Let's be frank. So we are in the driver's seat as far as the Russians are concerned for Ukraine. They're expecting, or at least hoping, that President Trump will take the reins of power, remove this regime, and arrange for a new regime. And that would be some interim government until elections are held. And I think that's what the Russians are looking for. And we have the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe that can supervise those elections to ensure that they are fair and free, and get a new government that can then sign, ultimately, an agreement that neutralizes the state and subscribes to the demilitarization/denazification. This needs to be taken seriously by the West. I don't know why we don't take it seriously, because I get the impression that people don't really think this is serious. It is serious. and we have to do it. But, you know, again, this is up to President Trump. President Trump can make these things happen. But the way you make them happen is cut off all the aid in cash, number one, and get our people out. That is the clearest, quickest, most cleanest way to do it, because that signals that we have had it. We are not going to support these people anymore. Then I think there's a chance for something good to happen. It would be nice if the Europeans then moved in and saw to it that we had elections in Ukraine and a new government. They are now obstructing this outcome and, frankly speaking, helping to keep this sort of Nazi nonsense going when it should not go on.
So let me ask you something, Doug, on that point there, because there's some real problems that are coming that are not being even addressed, much less solved by the European side. And that is, yes, as you said a second ago, really it was the U.S. who was the driver of the Biden administration that started this war and facilitated it. And then the Europeans were only too enthusiastic to jump on board. But now then with Trump coming on, it's like this iceberg has been moving, or a glacier has been moving in that direction for 3 years. Trump suddenly broke off and went this way, but the glacier can't stop on a dime or anything, and it's still rolling in the direction that it was, which is totally incompatible with where the Trump administration is going. In the event that he either does what you suggest or the negotiations simply don't work and Russia keeps fighting until they get what they want, that's going to leave the whole of Western Europe in a really big jam, because all they've talked about for three now into the fourth year is to weaken Russia and make it so they can force him into peace, all that kind of nonsense that Zelensky said. But at some point, if what you say is right, either the Dnieper will be reached or a negotiated settlement will be reached, that they give away all this land, and then they're all going to be left going, what do we do now? How is Europe going to respond when the reality slams home and they can't spend it anymore?
As I said before, without us, they can undertake nothing. As soon as we make it clear that we've had it, we're finished, we're leaving, we will not support this regime at all under any circumstances. The European electorates are going to watch that. They're going to know what happened. And there's already great movement in the direction of ejecting the governments in Paris, London, and Berlin from power. Now, the Germans, I think, in a fit of sheer insanity, just voted to appropriate money well beyond their budgetary capability. And they violated the Grundgesetz, the Constitution, to do it. But I don't think it has any long-term stability. I think we have to make it clear what we will and will not do. And at that point, the Europeans will have to come to terms with reality. If we don't do that, we will continue to bleed cash and aid, and we will continue to lose what credibility we have with the Russians. And again, the most important objective in all of this is for us to reconcile our differences with the Russians, to normalize our relations. That's the number one objective. We should not lose sight of that objective.
Absolutely, yeah. And Trump is on that, whether he's sometimes it seems that may be drifting into the background or so, but I think if he put that on the front burner, that would help clear things up about what to do next. And one of the things that may imply that he does have it on the front burner is Steve Witkoff, in an interview with Tucker Carlson over the weekend, implied, or he actually stated, that is, beyond the wars with some of what's driving President Trump right here. But in terms of what is going to be required to reach this end state, Lavrov has been talking about, he just mentioned about the denazification, but the other big thing, which according to Witkoff is the probably the central biggest thing, is what territory is going to be going to whom. Here's how he put it.
First of all, I think the largest issue in that conflict are these so-called four regions: Donbass, yes, Crimea, the names, Lugansk, and there's two others. They're Russian-speaking. Yep. There have been referendums where the overwhelming majority of the people have indicated that they want to be under Russian rule. Yes. I think that's the key issue. in the conflict. So that's the first thing. That when that gets settled, and we're having very, very positive conversations.
And Russia
around that.
controls that. In fact, some of those territories are now, from the Russian perspective, part of Russia.
Correct. That's correct. But this has always been the issue,
right?
And it's sort of no one wants to talk about it. That's the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is there are constitutional issues within Ukraine as to what they can concede to with regard to giving up territory. The Russians are de facto in control of these territories.
Yes.
The question is, will they be? Will the world acknowledge that those are Russian territories? Will it end up? Can Zelensky survive politically if he acknowledges this? This is the central issue in the conflict.
And I think that indirectly ties into the political stuff because Witkoff instead mused out loud. And by the way, obviously they knew that this was going to be blasted all over Russia and Ukraine specifically. But he said, can he survive politically? I think the answer is clearly no, or he probably would have been doing something like that before. So then and by the way, that message was received in Ukraine, as this headline from today shows that they're livid about that. They said it's absolutely unacceptable what Witkoff said regarding the occupied territories, et cetera. But that wasn't a slip of the tongue. That was a planned situation. So what do you think that the messages are from Witkoff? And then I guess really what do you expect is going to happen in the near term on those territories?
The last time I looked, Secretary Rubio is Secretary of State, not Mr. Witkoff. Mr. Witkoff has no authority, no standing, and he is yet expressing opinions and discussing terms that, frankly, should not be discussed in public. I hate to be blunt, but that's not his job. He's not appointed as an ambassador. He's not a Secretary of State. He's simply the president's friend, and that's fine. But I don't think the things that he is saying carry the same weight as they would if the Secretary of State said them. Now, why am I pointing that out? Very simply, you asked before, why isn't President Trump moving decisively to do some of these things that we discussed? Who are the people that he's appointed to his cabinet? Who are the people on his National Security Council staff? Who is his national security advisor? Who is the Secretary of Defense? Who is the Director of Central Intelligence? Where do these people fit in? You know, when Putin sent a team to visit with us and discuss the first time around in Saudi Arabia what they wanted to achieve, the head of the State Security Service was in the group. And you had someone who was, for all intents and purposes, the equivalent of Mr. Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce. What I'm trying to get across is this is not a coherent policy. This is not a coherent strategy. There's nothing wrong with what Mr. Witkoff said, and I'm sure he's telling you the truth. It's not the whole picture because there's something else here that was missing entirely from his statement, which is very important to Moscow. Moscow does not want to refight this war in 5 or 10 years. In other words, setting aside whatever the territorial arrangement turns out to be, what about Ukraine itself? Is it truly going to be neutral? And what are the definitions of that neutrality? I've often talked about the Austrian state treaty as a model. I think that's a good model. But that's part of denazification, demilitarization, the elimination effectively of the Zelensky regime. Where do we stand on that? And President Trump is the man with the authority, the power, and the influence to remove Zelensky and his regime. They need to go. He also needs to look carefully at who is in the State Department, the Department of Defense, and on the National Security Council staff and council before he goes back to the Russians, because there are lots of people there that have strongly supported this fiasco in Ukraine. Now, being political animals, they tend to blow with the wind. Lots of people in Washington are windsocks, but that's not very convincing for the Russians, Dan. They're not sure they can believe what we're saying or trust what we're saying. That is effectively what Foreign Minister Lavrov said.
So, given all that, if you're looking at it from the Russian perspective for a second, and all the things you just said, it seems to me like the only plausible, the most likely course of action, I guess, is the expectation that because there's a convoluted and lack of a clear strategic objective, that they'll just keep fighting until they end up taking on the ground what they want to take. I mean, it seems to me that maybe to a degree, hard to believe these words are coming out of my mouth, Zelensky may be right that the Russians are dragging out these talks, even for the limited ceasefire, because they don't believe they're going to go anywhere anyway. And instead of trusting us, they're just going to take it on the ground. How do you see it?
Well, I don't believe anything that Zelensky says, and I don't think you should take anything he says seriously. He's trying to shift blame for the absence of any ceasefire or any agreement on the Russians. The Russians, frankly, are not the problem. He is. The Russians are not spitting in our face. The Russians are not lying to us. Zelensky has lied to us, and Zelensky spits in our face. So let's get that straight. That's something President Trump needs to understand. If we want this war to end, I've outlined what needs to be done. And I think President Trump can do that. It's very clear that what Ukraine looked like 3+ years ago and what it looks like today are not the same and will not be the same. That's very clear. Beyond that, I think there's a lot of room for negotiation, provided we're looking at a neutral state. And that means a different government. Do you think that we could have accommodated in World War II a new government in Vienna at the end of the war that included Hitler? Of course not. And neither will the Russians. So my point is, let's get with the program and understand what's really required to end this war. And I think that's not an opportunity to grandstand and pretend that we imposed peace, that we are the instrument of justice. I think what we need to do is simply say, this has been a terrible mistake, a terrible war. We want to end it. We're going to work with President Putin to do that. And we're going to work with a new government in Kiev. And we're going to ask our European allies to assist us with that progress.
Right. But so what happens? My real question is, look from the Russian perspective, all of that stuff you just talked about, let's assume that we don't come to the reality. We don't recognize either in Kiev or in Brussels or anywhere else. And President Trump doesn't compel that vision. What are the Russians going to do? Because it seems to me that they're willing to be polite, as you just mentioned, but I think that their actions they're just going to fight until they win it on the ground.
Well, I think they have won it, Dan. I mean, this is a giant mop-up exercise, if you will. You know, after we took the Philippines and subsequently when we took Okinawa, the war in both of those areas did not end immediately. We had mop-up operations that took months. So I think that's what the Russians are resigned to, mopping up. And that's what they'll do. Beyond that, I can't predict that the Russians will just ignore anything we say or anything we do. I don't think that's the case. As I said before, I think they very much want to accommodate President Trump, very sincerely. I think Mr. Witkoff made that same argument, made it very clear. This was not a contentious discussion that he had with the Russians. They are genuinely interested in ending this thing. So the question is, how do we get there? What's the best way to do it? We're not going to get there with the Zelensky regime in power, Dan. That's obvious. Yeah, so they need to go.
Yep. Don't disagree with you on that. And it's one way or the other. I think that's going to end up happening. We'll just have to, as you say, wait and see how this rolls out. I want to shift gears in the amount of time we have left, because there's a lot of other things going on that we want to take advantage of your presence here today to talk about. And that, of course, is in the Middle East. Now, there was an interview with Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, on Sunday, I believe it was, with Mark Levin on Fox News. And the discussion of the way that Mark Levin presented the situation was, he asked the Secretary of Defense, he said, Iran represents a grave threat to the United States. That's how he started this. And he says, what do you say? Here's how Hegseth responded.
We are at a moment under this administration where President Trump is giving them an offer. He is saying, now is your chance to come to the table and completely give up and dismantle your program. Let's talk. I'd prefer to talk rather than do anything else. At the same time, he is ensuring that at the Defense Department and across our military, we maintain all capabilities necessary to work with our partners to, if we have to, and we don't want to, but if we have to, prevent Iran from gaining nuclear capabilities. So he's clear. The position is clear. Iran understands their options. There's never been a more serious leader atop the United States of America. There's a very serious leader atop the state of Israel. There's a clear message that Iran cannot get a nuclear bomb, and we are prepared to enforce it.
Okay, Doug, first things first. Does Iran pose a grave threat to the United States?
No.
And if that be the case, then, and since at least according to the last 20 years, both the CIA and the Mossad have both publicly said that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapons program. They're increasing their capacity, the breakout time is shrinking, etc. But so far, they have not actually had it. So what is the impetus right now that seems to be compelling these, urgent actions to tell them they can't have a bomb when they don't have one?
The Israel lobby.
Is that okay? Towards what end? Because actually, in the Israeli media today, there is some concern on their side that the Netanyahu government is trying to compel Trump into this. It says that he is inspired by Trump to act after Biden's warning against altering democracy. Actually, that's not the one I was looking for, Gary, not just yet. There was another one where the Israelis were saying that they're trying to go to war against Iran and trying to drag the United States in with him. So there seems to be some acknowledgement. Yeah, that's the one right there. So that's what the Haaretz is saying, the Israeli media. Is that true?
On the face of it, yes.
And so why do you suppose that, this is a silly question, but Trump, who's nearly everywhere else always talking about wanting peace, he wants to stop the killing, et cetera, like in the Ukraine war here, and he's always been against stupid wars, especially in the Middle East. But why do you suppose that he would be convinced? And money aside, I mean, a lot of people gave money to his campaign. Why would he be so willing to go down a path that I think would be clearly antagonistic for the United States and terribly unproductive?
The Israel lobby.
But but I get that they wanted that. There's no question about that. The question is, why are we participating in it?
I think you have to go back and look at what's happened over the last 3 decades. Mark Levin is a very articulate spokesman for that position. And the argument has been forever, whether it's the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, which we finally usually call the Foundation for the Destruction of Everything. These entities have all been extraordinarily well-financed for many, many years to push the United States into direct conflict with Iran on the grounds that Israel as a state in the Middle East will never be secure or safe until Iran is subjugated. Now, subjugated means its offensive military capability, which is all missile, frankly, and firepower over great distance, in other words, striking power, until that's eliminated. That's the position. And the Israel lobby has funded everyone on the Hill holding a position in the House or the Senate, as well as candidates to become members of the cabinet. They have funded that position and people that support it. Right now, they exert more control directly over how Congress will behave, over how the White House will behave as a result than they ever have in their past. So what you're effectively is asking me is, if this is not really in the interest of the American people, why is President Trump prepared to do it? And I think it's because President Trump obviously favors Israel. There's no mystery at that, and I certainly understand that. But he also made commitments in the run-up to the election and over the last couple of years that if he were elected, he would follow through on this. And I think that's the essence of his ultimatum. Now, I don't think ultimatums are a good idea. They don't usually work. We gave an ultimatum to Spain in 1898, and actually the Spaniards pretty much accepted it, and we still went to war with them. A similar event happened with Austria-Hungary vis-a-vis Serbia. The Serbs accepted all the provisions of the ultimatum except one, and Austria-Hungary should have been satisfied with that, but instead went to war. And I think the Iranians are looking at what we're saying to them as another ultimatum that will inevitably lead to war against them. And most states, most of the time, no matter how small they may be, and remember, Serbia was quite small in comparison to Austria-Hungary. Spain, though it was still in the rank of, I would say, middleweight power, it was a long way from the Western Hemisphere, but they don't usually negotiate well under pressure. In other words, if you threaten them, they find it very difficult to accede to your wishes. So I think we're in a difficult position now because we've made this ultimatum. Either you sit down and talk to us, which implies that we're going to demand from you some version of what previously we had with the Obama administration, this GCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Agreement about Nuclear Weapons. And you've got to do this with us now, or we're going to bomb you into the Stone Age.
And you know, but part of the problem with that is that they're not even going back to that one. I think they're asking something that's almost impossible for the Iranians to add. What's being reported is two specifically new components. One is that they dismantle their entire long-range missile capacity, so they don't have the ability to transport any nuclear warheads, and then that they dismantle, like physically, their nuclear energy program to include all the centrifuges, everything, so that they can't even do it. And I can't think of any nation on the planet that would agree to that.
Well, I tend to agree with you, and I think the underlying truth is Israel has us in a position where we are obligated to support anything they do, and they are waging a war for regional supremacy, effectively a war to subjugate everyone in the region to their will.
But
and as long as they have us, they're quite confident they can achieve that.
Yeah,
if they're on their own, it's a much more difficult proposition.
But I'm not convinced that they could accomplish that militarily anyway. I mean, let's just look at the first element of it, the Iran part. You touched on this a second ago, but just from a military perspective for the moment, let's say that the U.S. gave the support similar to what we did when we helped Israel, and it's the couple of times when it's either fended off attacks from Iran or assisted apparently in some of the Iranian attacks into Iran. But if you actually went to war with them and said, all right, we're going to bomb your facilities, et cetera, what would Iran likely do in response? And then how would we counter that? Meaning, this seems like to me it could go off the rails, but not succeed. You're not going to destroy a country just by air and missile power.
Well, I don't necessarily disagree with you. And you know, I've written on this subject and talked about it. And this is a subject for discussion about the plausibility of what we think we can or can't do. I think the coming strikes scheduled for the Houthis are designed to be a demonstration, in fact, of what can be done to Iran. I don't think that's going to change anything in Iran, as you know. But you've got to understand that you're asking the really critical question is, go ahead and bomb, and then what?
Right.
What comes after? And after, to the Israelis and to the Washington government right now, administration, is the inability of Iran to pose any threat under any circumstances to Israel. Period. Which means that it's effectively disarmed and rendered impotent as a nation. It's not sovereign anymore because anything it does to create a military capability beyond its borders to defend itself in the form of missiles, rockets, or anything else is unacceptable. The other issue is, what does this mean for the Egyptians? What does this mean for the Turks? What does this mean for the Saudis, the Emirates? And obviously, you know, with Russia now having signed what effectively is a mutual defense pact with Iran, what does this mean for Russia? And China, that has made it very clear that in the event that we attack Iran, they will stand by Iran. So you're right. I'm not arguing against you. The point is that that's not really being discussed. The point is they want a war and they want to bomb. And they're convinced that high altitude bombing combined with missile strikes can render Iran incapable of waging war in the future against anyone. And then as a result, Israel will then reign supreme over the region.
That assumes that they can destroy all of their nuclear missile capabilities like in one fell swoop, because otherwise, Doug, I mean, what about this is one of the things that irks me the most from any U.S. administration. There are a lot of U.S. forces peppered around Syria and Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East that are completely vulnerable to a lot of the better missiles that Iran has. And if we get into a war with them, what's to stop them from actually attacking our own people? And a lot of the air defenses on those smaller bases are not adequate to defend against. I mean, we could have our own people killed.
Well, the answer to your question is nothing. Nothing can stop it. And I think President Trump is acutely sensitive to that reality. The question is he willing to risk that on the assumption that the damage to Iran will be so severe that they will not respond in that way, or if they attempt to respond in that way, matters will simply be worse for them. You know, we're not privileged to sit in on the discussions and the consultations. So we don't know. You know, I'm sure there are voices that are saying, well, we could use tactical nuclear weapons to utterly annihilate the Houthis, or potentially utterly annihilate the Iranian nuclear capability. To me, that would be sheer lunacy. I would say that's the first step towards Armageddon. And you can't disguise what you're doing. If you used any sort of nuclear device, it would register. And the predisposition at that point would be for lots of countries to take up arms against us. So I don't know what the answer is. You're asking all the right questions. I cannot conceive of any set of circumstances under which I would support an attack on Iran based upon what I've seen thus far. I don't think it makes sense. I don't think it'll work. And I think it could have terrible consequences regionally and beyond the region, potentially in Europe, Asia, and the United States. So I don't support it. And I'm not in the administration, and neither are you. So I think we should come to the understandable conclusion that our opinion is unwanted. So I don't know what's being discussed behind closed doors, but I think the decision has been made to do something. And it inevitably revolves around high altitude bombing and missile strikes. Now we're adding another carrier battle group. We could have as many as 3 there very shortly, depending upon decisions in Washington. That would certainly beef up the fighter jets. And also remember that those flotillas include other naval ships and vessels that carry lots of missiles. And you have submarines. So there's a lot of firepower being assembled that could be directed at Iran. And I think the Iranians know that. I think the Russians know it. The Chinese know it. It's a difficult situation, but the gauntlet is being tossed in front of Iran. Either sit and negotiate with us on the terms that you accurately cited, or face the equivalent of Armageddon. We will bomb the living daylights out of you.
Well, so in the remaining time we have left here, Doug,
I don't have much time, so I
Oh,
got to
you
go
are.
in about four minutes. So
Okay, whatever time you have left, what would Russia and China do, given their interest in the last few minutes you have? What would they do in the event that we actually do attack?
well, obviously, I haven't sat in on any consultations there either. So all I can do is speculate, but I would think that a determined assault on Iran would persuade the Russians that they must act to support Iran, because if they do not, they are probably next on the menu, in which case China may also reach a similar conclusion. They may decide that we're a rogue state, that we are no longer calculable. In other words, we're not measured, we're incautious. And as a result, they've got to take action to support Iran, which would include action against us.
Well, let's don't find out if you're right on that. And I wish you were consulted by the administration. We would be much better for it. But again, Doug, let me let you go because I know you got to run. Grateful for having you on today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. Bye-bye.
And appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't before you left. And also, we're going to be talking about another hot topic in the news at 3:00 this afternoon. This whole group Intel chat security breach. It's been going on Signal. That's a hot topic on a Senate hearing right now, which was pre-planned already on an intelligence. Timing couldn't have been worse for some of the folks on that deal there. We're going to show you some of the fireworks that happened on the Senate floor this afternoon and talk about the ramifications. 3:00 today on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We'll look forward to seeing you there.